the hungry, and he wants us to do the same. He wants us to alleviate pain as much as we can. But then he added to these people, it was only when Christ wept and was able to weep that he understood our human dramas. Today's whole world needs to weep. We've got a lot of things to weep about. And when we have no words that make any sense coming out of our mouths, maybe the best expression we have can come out of our eyes. Men especially, we've been taught not to cry. It's not manly. What a mistake not to be able to grieve. It dams up all the rest of the feelings too, except maybe anger. And we need to learn that certain realities of life are only seen a little more clearly with eyes that have been cleansed by tears. We need the prayer of lament, not just petition to make it all better and make the bad stuff go away, but just lament. I mean, look at the book of Psalms. Almost half of them are Psalms of lamentation. People had enough trust and relationship with their God, with that covenant between them, that they could complain out loud like crazy to that God, knowing that it wasn't going to hurt their relationship, and they expected an answer. Maybe the church needs more of that kind of prayer. A 26-year-old woman named Kayla Mueller takes this even a step further. You might remember that she was the young woman who did humanitarian work in Syria. She was kidnapped and then murdered by ISIS militants. This follower of Jesus at her young age had probably grasped a deeper understanding of God than most of us do in our lifetimes. She had written to her father on his previous birthday, I find God in the suffering eyes reflected in mine. If this is how you are revealed to me, God, well then this is how I will forever see you. She said, some people find God in church, in nature, in love, but I find God in suffering. What a rare insight to realize that we have a God who suffers. Not one who's got arms crossed or is working this big board of what's going to happen to whom, but a God who doesn't like what's going on and who suffers with us. Isn't it different at a time when we're talking to God, really having a hard time, if God is far, far away and we say, why are we letting this happen? And then having a God right next to us with an arm around us saying, I'm not letting anything happen. I give everybody freedom. I let the world have an incredible amount of dignity to make decisions on their own. I hate what some people have done with them. And then just weep with us. Wouldn't that be a different kind of God? It's the kind that at 26 years of age, Kayla Mueller discovered. And she also wrote, I remember Mom always telling me that in the end, the only one you really have is God. We lose everything else. Like Pope Francis, she doesn't suggest that God wants or allows us to suffer, nor that suffering has a, quote, higher purpose. In her experience, she simply sees the darkness around her for what it is. She gives it a name, and she summons up the strength and the vision to find grace even in the midst of that. And just says, sometimes we have to look harder than others for the grace. In very simple yet courageous words, this woman who was really martyred echoes some profound insights of the Scriptures and of our Christian tradition, our Judeo-Christian tradition. She's saying the kind of things that were said by the prophets, that are in the book of Job, that were written by St. Paul and later by John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and Mother Teresa, and the list goes on. So that brings me now into the last part of this evening. You doing okay? Hanging in there? What side is it? Okay, we're doing fine. I'm doing fine. I shouldn't speak for everyone. This just kind of came to me as I was preparing in the early stages that I needed to do those first two sections before really addressing head-on the reality of suffering and pain in our lives. I would guess, not only guess, but I think I've heard through third-party conversations, that some people aren't here tonight because they didn't want to face it at all. They'd rather not look at a topic like this. I thank you so much for coming and taking a look at its reality, which is so much a part of our human experience. And because it's human, it needs to be addressed by our faith. Thank you. So the main reason why I spent some time talking about the love of God and the humanity of Jesus first in the context of this mission is because we really need that compassionate love and that intimacy of relationship more than ever when we're hurting, when we're in pain, when suffering is a part of our lives. So I'd like to make one distinction that might seem like a false one, but just bear with me. I'm not preaching the gospel at this point. It's just an idea. That maybe there's a difference between pain and suffering. Pain, according to one understanding, is simply an objective experience. I feel pain. Pain exists. I have it because I cut something, I broke something, my heart was broken, someone left me in whatever way they did. Pain is that objective experience. Pain happens. If we're grieving, we're also struggling and suffering at some point. We make mistakes. We get our hearts broken. Philip Simmons is a man who wrote a book as he went through his struggle with ALS. The name of the book, at least the first part of the title, is Learning to Fall. It's an absolutely wonderful book. And he says in one chapter, the first time I fell down the stairs as a toddler was a fall out of the Garden of Eden. The rest of life is about learning how to fall, because it's going to happen. We're not in charge here, he writes, whether we experience disaster or delight. After all, how many of us are exactly living the life that we had in mind years ago? Now, maybe some of you who are retired are living it. Good for you. Congratulations. But he writes, with all our planning and goals and strategies and vision and commitment, then life happens. Things fall apart. They stop working. We're not sure what's going to happen next or what should happen next. And the most important events of our lives end up being things we couldn't predict or control. That's all from Simmons in Learning to Fall, and the rest of the book is marvelous. And yet I've heard it said that only 10% of life is really what happens, and that the other 90% is made up of our reaction and response to what happens. Now, the percentages might be different for you, but doesn't it kind of make sense? We spend an awful lot of time replaying what happened, responding to, coming up with reasons for, etc., etc. I mean, who wouldn't prefer comfort to pain? So when the pain happens, we have all kinds of different responses to it. And it might be my avoiding it or being distracted from it that ends up causing suffering, more suffering in the long run. The great spiritual writer and monk Thomas Merton wrote it like this: indeed, the truth that many people never understand until it's too late is the more you try to avoid suffering, the more you suffer. Because smaller and more insignificant things begin to torture you in proportion to your fear of being hurt. It's not a real easy sentence, but it's like when I start getting afraid of what's going to happen next, every little thing becomes more painful, all for the sake of avoiding the one thing that is a pain that maybe has something to teach me. He's not saying, of course, that pain has a value in itself. We won't hear that coming out of my mouth, or that we should go looking for it. But when it happens, as it does to anyone with a heartbeat, there's some wisdom about how we might live more fully and enter more deeply into the heart of God. Into the heart of God by not going around the pain, but going through it and letting God go through it with us. To drink from the cup that Jesus drank from. One reason we might not act as he suggests, again, is because of our expectations of how life ought to go. And these will all sound familiar because if we didn't say them, somebody we know said them. I shouldn't have to go through all this. I've lived a good life. I probably agree. You shouldn't have to go through it, but guess what? You're going through it. So how are you going to handle it? I have a good friend who some years ago was diagnosed with a cancer that only adolescents get. And she was expected to die from it because they didn't know what to do with adults. And she said, a lot of people, when they get diagnoses like that, say, why me? She said, well, why not me? I know what the statistics are. I know what the percentages are of people getting cancer. There was a 1 in 3 chance, or whatever it is now, 1 in 4 chance, that it might be me. So I've got it. So let's pray, and let's find the best doctors in the country. She's still telling the story. Not everybody has a personality, but it's something that struck me very strongly. Or we might say, it's not my fault that it happened. Okay, maybe not. What if it's nobody's fault? Why won't God just take it away? Of course, being a spiritual director, I often say, well, I think you should bring that to prayer and talk to God about that. Maybe God will tell you, he's trying to take it away, or he's trying to teach you something. I don't know what happened. And then after you ask God why God doesn't take it away, then listen to the answer. That's the most forgotten part of our prayer. We go, like I am going tonight. But then we don't listen to what God might have to say. And on the other hand, even less healthy than what I'm describing here is the other extreme, where people say, I probably deserve it. I've been bad. I should suffer even more than I do. Others have it worse than me. There's got to be a reason. May I suggest that perhaps the church has enough martyrs already? We don't need more self-proclaimed martyrs. Someone said that the definition of a saint is somebody who lives with a martyr. Isn't that good? Nobody knows the trouble I've shared. So based on those two extremes of give me more pain or I'm going to get out of it and what did I do to deserve it, I've put together, like the authors of some best-selling books, which I will never have, but 7 highly effective ways to avoid pain. And unfortunately the subtitle is and end up with more suffering. This is kind of the negative approach, and tomorrow evening I'm going to talk about a more positive approach that brings us into the ambit of the cross of Jesus and give us a way that's much more constructive to face pain. But I think it's important to say this part just so we can catch ourselves doing it and know that this is spiritually healthy as well as not psychological and probably not even physically healthy. Number one of the 7 highly effective ways to avoid pain is to run like crazy from it. Conceal it, cover it up, numb it, anesthetize it. Especially effective are alcohol, drugs, sex, over busyness, TV, computer, anything that we can get addicted to might help to take some of the pain away for about that long. Number 2, if you hear Jesus ask the question that he asks a lot of people in scriptures when they're sick and need healing, he said, do you want to be healed? Then our answer in this case should be, healed from what? I'm fine. And just pretend that we are. Deny there's anything wrong, or say, listen, as long as you're asking me the question, could you kind of fix it quickly? Okay? I got stuff to do tomorrow. Our whole culture reinforces this. That's not just a joke. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Get on with it. Ask your doctor if you need the purple one, or the red one, or the green one, or whatever. We have mind-boggling technology, and we have great national wealth that have allowed us to relieve so much of suffering, which is great to relieve it, but almost to the point of believing that it shouldn't exist at all. And it just does. And then when we can't fix it with a pill or anything else, we tend to blame someone. There's got to be a scapegoat. We love scapegoats. Sue somebody. Make money off of it anyway, even if it still hurts. And it might even be God that we decide to blame. Number 3, isolate yourselves. Be alone, mope a lot. Hope that someone will notice and give you sympathy and pity. Don't ask for help, because then there might be a creative way that could actually not only alleviate some of the pain, but also transform us and deepen our lives. Number 4, act joyful all the time, because Jesus is risen and we're Christians and we're happy. Smile. We can't. And the reason is, again, I'm not talking about people's behaviors really, I'm talking about the fact that the joy is not authentic. If we can't feel the pain, we can't feel the joy. It would be so nice to be able to pick and choose which feelings I want to have. But if we can't feel one, we're not going to feel the other. And then we'll be like the people in Scripture who Jesus says, they sing a dirge and they aren't able to cry. They sing a little happy tune and they're not able to dance. What's wrong with these people? And in some cases, it's because they're living in their heads and denying their hearts. And then, just to save you from something even more painful of number 5, 6, and 7, I'll put them together and say it's the 3 friends of Job who are all trying to help him with his pain, because he's an innocent who doesn't know why he's suffering, and he's sitting there on the dung heap. And friend number 1 says, you got to blame somebody. Number 2 says, let's second guess God. And number 3 says, I learned this in theology class, and say something pious. Their disciples, those 3, by the way, still live among us. They're not in this parish. They're other people. I'm always talking about other people. You know that this whole section is tongue-in-cheek, right? You're not supposed to be avoiding the pain. Alleviating it, yes, but not avoiding it when it's there. Their disciples are the ones who say to us, you must have done something to deserve it. God is testing you. Okay, tell me more about your sadistic God. Do you like that expression, God doesn't give us more than we can handle? I hate it. You think that's God giving us that? I don't think so. I think it's life giving us that. Or people who say, well, it's not so bad. You want to say, no, not for you. You don't feel it. Things will soon be better, or get on with it. You know, that's the American way. I'll never forget the man in the parish where I was ministering, who always complimented me on my homilies, even though he told me they were long, which you will certainly understand this week, but then I'm going to leave town, so don't worry. You'll be back to the Father in no time. He always complimented me until a period in my life when my best friend was in a car accident that put her in a coma for 6.5 weeks before she died. During that time, I probably preached, and I wasn't talking about myself. I was talking about the Scriptures. That's my job as preacher. But the way in which I preached while she was in her coma was the most profound, heartfelt, vulnerable, and sensitive homilies I had ever preached. After a period of time after Sue's death, this man came up to me and said, I'm so glad you're back on track with your usual homily, meaning they're entertaining and humorous at times. I was ready to smack him. But I realized that probably here was another person running like crazy from the pain of his own life, and he didn't want to feel mine. I've acted in similar ways. I mean, I never preach to anybody without preaching to myself first. If it doesn't make sense to me, I'm not going to share it with you. Do you ever eat when you're not hungry? Because you're trying to deal with difficult feelings? I am so sad. Yeah, that'll help. But now I'm so overweight. And it goes on and on and on. There's one of those attempts to not deal with the real feelings, or procrastinating the activities that I know I have to do, and then it's like, oh, how did I get so far behind? Because you avoided pain and played for a while. I avoided pain when I was little by always having to go to the bathroom when the dishes had to be done. We probably all have our own ways of avoidance, certainly. Many Jewish people at the time of Jesus thought that their suffering would finally be over. Thanks to Jesus, who they recognized as the warrior Messiah, who would ride into town and finally end this domination by the Romans. One of his followers, Simon, was a zealot. He was of that school of thought that the Messiah was going to be a military Messiah who would liberate his people, God's people. But Jesus fooled everybody. It's another one of those upside-down things. There were different models of Messiah, and instead of picking the one of warrior, which everybody would have liked in the Jewish community, instead he went to the book of the prophet Isaiah and said, no, I think I'm going to be this kind of Messiah. And he chose the suffering servant. Why? He threw everybody's expectations off. We've already talked about how he threw Peter's off. I won't let anything happen to you, Jesus. Yeah, sure. Not only will it happen, but you'll deny me too. And Jesus, who surprised them with the kind of Messiah he was, is still surprising you and me. Though it often happens in the rearview mirror. When we look back at an experience and what seemed terrible and tragic because, in fact, it really was, as I look at it later and having gone through it, and we've probably all done that at times in our lives, we see it through the tears, we see it through the grief, we see it through depression, all of them normal and ordinary experiences that are appropriate. But then, in the big picture, we begin to see it not so much as just this horribly dark smudge in our lives, but we see something more as what St. Paul calls dark or obscure, seeing it darkly in a mirror, not being able to see it clearly later for the role that it might play in our lives. And actually, I'm just thinking now of one example that I hadn't thought about when I was writing this. But I remember one woman who was so cautious in saying this to me. She said, you know, Bill's been dead now for a year or two. And you know how much I love Bill and what a great family we had. And the marriage was fantastic. I hated to lose him. You knew how sorry I was and how much I grieved and cried and everything else. But she said, you know, at this point, a couple of years later, I'm sort of more alive in some ways in myself than I've ever been. I have a kind of freedom that's really interesting. And although I miss him every day and would prefer that he's still here, I've got a second wind to live my life as fully as I possibly can. I think it would be cruel to think that someone should feel that way as they're going through it. But when we come into the light and then look through the rearview mirror, who knows then, only then, not before when you say, well, God has a plan. Well, that's not helpful. But afterwards, I might look back and say, you know what? Something happened there that also has made me who I am here and who I desire to continue to be, because he's gone, but I'm not. So I shouldn't act as if I am too. I've still got life. May we never minimize anybody's feelings. It's a good American tradition. Oh, you shouldn't feel that way. You know what? I do. I'm sorry. But without minimizing their feelings, in reflecting back, I would be willing to bet that every one of us can identify some experience where it was precisely at the point where we realized, I've lost control. I'm not in charge anymore. I don't know what to do. That at that moment, the potential is born for what I've heard preached for years and years to actually happen in real life, and I let a merciful and compassionate and suffering God guide me. Sometimes it's only when I get to the point of saying, I can't do it, that I'll let God do it. Because I don't know what else to do. But then God comes more real. Would I order that experience if I were writing the script of my life? No way. But if it happens, and it has, and it does, and it will, where is God in the middle of all that? That's always the question I would ask people when they came for spiritual direction. They would talk about every kind of experience possible. And at some point I would always say, and what has God got to do with this? where's God now? Sometimes they wouldn't know and wouldn't have to. But then I remember Caleb's words, the 26-year-old in Syria, who said, the only one we really have, when all is said and done, is God. So God comes most alive sometimes when we feel most dead. Isn't that weird? We can, in fact, discover not only much about God, but about ourselves and about one another and about our relationships in and through the human experience of pain and suffering. That's what I'm hoping to do in these 3 evenings, to just give a little taste of how that might happen as a way of encouraging the healing that comes not by running away, but by going through it and doing it not alone, but together, and doing it with an increasing faith and trust in God, despite all the evidence to the contrary. I kind of tongue-in-cheek talked about the ways we avoid pain, and it was only funny because we caught ourselves doing it, I'm sure. But tomorrow I'll try to talk about a more proactive, positive approach to dealing with and going with God through pain and suffering in the light of the cross of Jesus Christ. If we didn't have the cross, I don't know if what I'm saying would make any sense, but that's at the heart of our faith, so we'll take a look at that in more detail. If you want a little bumper sticker type saying to walk away with, one of them is, there's no way to overcome without undergoing. We can't overcome without undergoing. There's no shortcut to the empty tomb that doesn't pass through Calvary. It's the only way to resurrection. And even then, we're not going to have the answers that solve everything, all the questions we've always had. We're still going to be in the middle of mystery. But it's a mystery of relationship. It's always a mystery of relationship. And that's what I want to leave you with tonight in terms of my words, and I'm going to do a little prayer with you at the end. Relationship is the key to what I'm saying all of these 3 evenings, because I think relationship is the key to everything. It's the heart of religious life. The heart of spiritual life, religious life. It's the heart of our Christian life. I'll say more things tomorrow and then next. But if in one sentence I can kind of summarize the mission, I would say that suffering might be called redemptive, or to use another word that might be an alternative for us, that suffering can be transforming, that it can deepen and make more full our lives, if it does 3 things. If through the experience of suffering, we deepen our trust and dependence on God. If we trust God more and depend more on God because of it, that's one thing that can redeem our suffering, just to use that word, or transform it. Second, that's about God. Now this one's about me, and this is what I'm going to be talking about for a pretty good part of tomorrow, half of it anyway. The suffering that strips us of everything that's false reveals my truer self, which I come to know. And the truer self that I discover is the self that God sees when God looks at me. Suffering can also transform us by stripping us of what's false and not really all that important. So there's God, then me, and third, relationships. Suffering is one thing that maybe more than anything else, except maybe the experience of love, that unites us with every other living person and creature. We all go through it. And it brings us into a relationship of mutuality, of concern. People are no longer anonymous when they're sharing pain. And it moves us to compassion, which is what Jesus was all about. Jesus is the compassion of God. So tomorrow night, I'll continue that reflection a little bit more, especially I talk about God a lot tonight, a little bit more about how that happens with us and how it happened with Jesus and what the relationship is with the cross of Christ. And I will ask for you to be, in a very safe way, involved tomorrow. in kind of a prayerful ritual with the cross. So I hope you come back, because each of these 3 nights builds on the night before it. I'd also like to mention, before we go into this final little reflection, that I'll be saying more on Wednesday, but as a servant of Mary, Saint Peregrine Laziosi is a saint that existed in the first century of my order's existence, and has become, over the years, the Church's universal patron for people suffering from cancer and from other life-threatening diseases. And so Wednesday, when we talk about a St. Peregrine healing Mass, you may or may not know what that is that you're going to be coming to on Wednesday. It's a Eucharist. We're going to celebrate the Eucharist, but there will be an anointing and prayer for healing through the intercession of this Peregrine, who has become such a strong figure in the lives of so many people who are dealing especially with cancer, but with other illnesses as well. That table back there, which some of you have seen already, has a few little goodies that I've brought from our office, our Servite office, where we promote devotion and prayer to St. Peregrine for the sake of the healing of people. None of it's for purchase, but because we have to pay to print it, we're always appreciative of donations, and there are some suggested donations there. But if you can't afford the donation, don't worry about it. It's for you. There are prayers, there are some medals, there's some blessed oil for anointing one another. So please help yourself there. And come back tomorrow, please. But what I'd like to do now is, let me check and see. You've been really so attentive. Oh, it's a little later than I thought. Okay. Let's do this anyway. I'll just make it a little shorter, which isn't really fair. But as a way of closing tonight, if you're comfortable doing this, I would ask you to let me guide you through a few minutes of a meditation on a scene that you are going to create in your own mind, in your own imagination. But sometimes God uses those gifts of thinking and feeling and imagination to lead us more deeply into God's own heart. So if you're comfortable doing it, I'd ask you to kind of put your feet flat on the floor and have your back straight, and perhaps close your eyes, if that's okay. And the main reason for closing your eyes is that I would just ask you to imagine right now that you are in one of your very favorite places on earth. It might be right here, on your lake, or in the town, in your house. It might be somewhere you've traveled to. Just think of some environment that for you immediately makes you think of peace and beauty, even as we've been thinking about much more difficult human experiences. Just picture it in your minds. What do you imagine around you? What's there? Is it some natural setting? And then as you sit there, imagining and now seeing yourself as being alone in your favorite place or one of your favorite places, another person appears, kind of on the horizon, and then starts walking toward you. As this person comes closer, you notice that there's a very gentle, caring sort of face. What does the face look like? You begin to recognize who this is. It's someone that you've believed in for a long time. Someone you may have gotten to know fairly well. As Jesus arrives, what posture does he take with you? Does he sit with you? Does he stand? Does he sit on the ground? At some distance, or maybe right next to you, put an arm around your shoulder. How does he look at you? And how do you feel as he gazes at you? Along with whatever else comes to mind, something that surfaces in your mind right now is where you're hurting, where you feel broken, what you're struggling with, and maybe how you've been relating to it recently, maybe running from it, maybe facing it and feeling it, perhaps actively grieving it, maybe telling others about it. Tell this person who's with you about it just for a few minutes. Tell them where it hurts. Tell them about your wound. I'm going to stop talking for a little while and just imagine what you would say, what you do say to him right now. And you might have a lot more that you'd like to say, and you can do that. But for a few moments, let's do the most important part of a prayer. What does Jesus say back to me? What do I hear him say in response to what I've shared with you? Is there anything else I want to say to Jesus at this point? And is there anything else he says to me? And now Jesus says, you know what? I have to leave you at this moment, but I'm really never far from you. You can talk to me like this anytime. So please do. We'll continue the conversation. I care about where you're hurt. I want to hear everything you have to say. But for now, he gets up. He greets you again in a way that would be appropriate for your relationship. And perhaps with a friendly smile or a real manifestation of compassion and care for you, he turns and begins to walk away from this moment only, knowing there could be lots more like it. And when you're ready to come back from this wonderful place to this church and this place on this night, which may also be one of your favorite places, feel free to open your eyes. That's not a form of prayer that's for everyone. But there are so many ways of praying. And it might just be the start of a continuing prayer for you. I'm always interested in hearing if you want to tell me afterwards if there was anything interesting that happened and that you would be willing to share. I did this at a parish mission once where my mother was present, and she said, "I love Hawaii," and Jesus was wearing one of those floral shirts. Now she knows what it really looks like. Someday I will too. Tomorrow, as I said, we'll continue the mission. Most people don't need any reminders of where their pain is or where their suffering is, but there are some handouts that I'd ask you to pick up on your way out. The part that lists some of the different areas of human suffering and difficulty isn't the main part. It's the questions on the other side. What do we do with those? And it might be interesting just to reflect on some of that when you come back tomorrow, because I'm going to ask you to do something, again, very, very safe and very personal, but to do something with those areas of hurt, just in your own heart and in a ritual way. So just to think about that, and maybe to even think, I think it's so important sometimes that for some of you, nothing that I've said tonight has been a new learning. You already know that. It's a time to just let it deepen, to settle in. You've been there, you've been through difficult times. I'm glad that you're here too. The community needs experience and wisdom. We take turns. When somebody's up and somebody else is down, we help the one who's down because it's going to be the other way around at some point. So that's wonderful. And you might just want to think about how you got through a really difficult time in your own life, especially in the light of faith. What part did God play? What part did Jesus play? What part did the Spirit play? Were there other Mary or saints? Or, just to think a little bit about if you've already had an experience where you've gotten through something dark and come into the light. That's always great learning for the next time it's going to happen. Because that's the way life is, dying and rising. Dying and rising, hitting the microphone, and I better stop. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I look forward to seeing you. Bring a friend if there's someone else that... Don't tell them you're bringing them to the foot of the cross. They might not come. But then again, if it hurts enough, they might. This is a safe place. This is a good place. Healing happens here. See you tomorrow night. Thank you.